I started off many years ago, maybe even being angry. Like, why are they taking my music? Why are they chopping it up? Why are they doing weird stuff?
The smooth veneer of jazz has always hidden a world of restless ambition, quiet rivalries, and untold stories. For decades, Bob James and Larry Carlton embodied the very spirit of this hidden realm, two giants whose music defined the sound of a generation. Together, they sculpted melodies that felt effortless, yet behind the studio glass, not everything was as harmonious as the records suggested. Now, at 85, Bob James finally lifts the curtain. What truths about Larry Carlton and their legendary collaboration has he kept buried for half a century? Long before Bob James became a household name in the jazz fusion era, he was the quiet genius lurking in the background, orchestrating arrangements that felt larger than life. Born in 1939, James was shaped by the turbulence of American music in transition. The jazz world of the 1960s was fracturing. Bebop purists clung to tradition, while others experimented with electronic instruments, funk grooves, and classical elements. Bob, a classically trained pianist, walked a tightrope between both worlds, never fully embraced by either camp. In those early years, he worked in relative anonymity, playing sessions and crafting arrangements for musicians who rarely gave him more than a passing credit. Yet those who knew him could sense a storm building. Bob James wasn't content with being just another pianist. He had vision. He wanted to fuse the elegance of classical structure with the electricity of jazz improvisation. Larry Carlton, meanwhile, was carving a path of his own. A guitarist from Southern California, Carlton was already a seasoned studio player by the time Bob's star began to rise. Known as Mr. 335 for his iconic Gibson ES-335 guitar, Carlton had played for Steely Dan, Joni Mitchell, and countless others. His guitar spoke with a searing clarity, equal parts precision and soul. But while Carlton was celebrated for his ability to elevate any track, he often found himself pigeonholed. The dependable sideman, not the headline act. The secret the jazz world didn't yet know was that when Bob James and Larry Carlton collided, they would create something more potent than either could alone. Their partnership was not born out of friendship or convenience. It was born out of necessity. Each saw in the other the missing piece they could not conjure alone. And as the 1970s loomed, with record labels desperate for a new sound to capture the ears of restless audiences, this unlikely pairing would soon set the jazz world ablaze. Their first real meeting wasn't orchestrated by fate, it was business. CTI Records, the powerhouse label of the 1970s, had become a playground for jazz experimentation under the vision of producer Creed Taylor. Taylor saw in Bob James the perfect arranger to give CTI's albums their lush, cinematic feel. But he also knew these productions needed fire, something raw and unforgettable. Enter Larry Carlton. The studio air was thick with cigarette smoke and expectation when Bob and Larry first crossed paths in those CTI sessions. Bob sat quietly at the piano, sketching out dense harmonies, while Larry tuned his guitar in the corner, waiting for the downbeat. Their first collaboration wasn't magical, it was tense. Bob's perfectionism clashed with Larry's improvisational spirit. Bob demanded structure. Larry demanded freedom. The two men, though respectful, regarded each other cautiously, like prize fighters circling the ring. But then came the take. Bob laid down a hypnotic chord progression, layered with cinematic tension. Larry responded not with compliance, but with defiance, a solo so biting, so fearless, that even Bob had to pause. The studio fell silent for a moment. Then Bob nodded. For the first time, he realized Carlton wasn't just another hired guitarist. He was a voice, one that could challenge his authority, yet elevate his vision. That night, the session ran long. Bob and Larry found themselves in an unspoken duel, each pushing the other to heights neither had reached before. By the end, what they had created wasn't just another CTI track. It was a new language, one built on the push and pull of control and chaos, and though neither would admit it aloud, they both knew something had changed. Sparks had flown in that studio, and those sparks would ignite a fire that carried through decades of music history. But fires burn both ways. They illuminate and they consume. The CTI years were a golden age for jazz fusion. Albums like White Rabbit and Breezin' gave the genre its cinematic sweep and mass-market appeal. Bob James became CTI's secret weapon, weaving arrangements that blurred the line between jazz and pop. Larry Carlton, though often uncredited or buried in liner notes, was the hidden dynamite in those recordings. His guitar sliced through Bob's orchestration with a kind of wild honesty that no one else could provide. But behind the curtain, things were never as polished as the record suggested. Bob James was meticulous to the point of obsession. Every note, every chord voicing had to serve the grand architecture of his vision. Larry, however, thrived on imperfection. The crack in the note, the bend that stretched just a hair too far, the improvised phrase that threatened to derail the arrangement but somehow made it more human. This clash created brilliance on tape, but tension in real life. Studio musicians whispered about heated arguments between takes, of Larry refusing to tone down his playing, and Bob demanding yet another retake to preserve the balance of his composition. Both men wanted greatness, but they defined it differently. And yet, neither could deny the results. CTI's sound became iconic, largely because of that very friction. The lushness of Bob James gave the records weight, while Larry Carlton's rawness gave them bite. Together, they shaped the identity of 1970s jazz fusion. But while listeners swooned over the music, few knew the price of those sessions. Egos bruised, tempers flared, and a growing rift that would simmer for years. Still, they kept returning to each other, session after session. Because deep down, both men knew they were trapped in a paradox. They couldn't stand the tension, but they couldn't live without it. By the mid-1970s, both Bob James and Larry Carlton were no longer just names floating in the back pages of liner notes. They were forces. Yet it wasn't stardom that kept them together, but the way their clashing personalities forged something neither could achieve alone. Their partnership was less a friendship and more a high-stakes gamble, each project balancing on the razor's edge between brilliance and collapse. Bob's world was precision. He carried the weight of classical training like a badge of honor, forever sculpting music into structured, almost architectural frameworks. For him, the studio was a cathedral where chaos had no place. Larry's world, however, was fire. His guitar lines were unpredictable, sometimes tender, sometimes violent, always alive. Carlton believed music was an expression of the moment, and to confine it too tightly was to kill its spirit. When these two worlds collided, the sessions often felt like battlegrounds. Engineers remembered how Bob would stop a take to adjust the smallest chord voicing, only for Larry to come storming in with a blistering solo that obliterated the framework Bob had so carefully constructed. And yet, every time, the end result was electric. Their clashes produced tension that lived inside the grooves of the record, tension the audience could feel without ever knowing the story behind it. There was risk in every note they played together. The risk that Bob's perfectionism would stifle Larry's improvisational magic. The risk that Larry's wildness would topple the balance of Bob's grand designs. But it was in that friction that the music found its heartbeat. Listeners didn't just hear beauty. They heard struggle, resolution, and the echo of two titans unwilling to compromise. For Bob James, who had spent years yearning to be more than a background arranger, Carlton was both a gift and a curse. He gave Bob's work the danger it needed to leap off the page, but he also threatened to steal the spotlight. And for Larry Carlton, who had grown tired of being the faceless guitarist in other people's bands, Bob was both the cage and the key, the man who tried to contain him, but also the man who gave him the stage on which to explode. Their partnership was no ordinary collaboration. It was forged in fire, sharpened by risk, and destined to either soar into legend or implode under its own weight. The turning point came in 1977 with Heads, Bob James's ambitious project that would thrust their collaboration into the spotlight. Unlike the controlled CTI sessions where they had first collided, this was Bob's own statement, his chance to carve out an identity separate from being just an arranger for others. And Larry Carlton was right there, ready to unleash his guitar into Bob's carefully constructed world. Heads was more than an album. It was a manifesto. Bob poured every ounce of his classical influence, jazz sensibility, and studio perfectionism into the arrangements. The pieces felt cinematic, sweeping, like soundtracks to films that hadn't yet been made. But as always, it needed fire. And Larry brought it. His guitar didn't merely decorate Bob's arrangements, it ripped through them, carving jagged edges into smooth surfaces. The solo on Nightcrawler became a moment fans still talk about, a raw, searing cry of independence that turned an otherwise polished track into something dangerous, unforgettable. The reception was staggering. Critics who once dismissed Bob James as too smooth or too commercial now had to reckon with the undeniable power of the record. And while Bob's name was on the cover, insiders knew Larry Carlton's guitar was the lightning bolt that made it immortal. But success is a double-edged sword. The album that should have cemented their bond instead deepened the rift. Bob received the lion's share of the credit, interviews, and label support, while Larry remained the eternal sideman in the public eye. Fans praised the Bob James sound, without realizing how much of that sound came from the man wielding the ES-335. Larry's frustration simmered quietly at first, hidden beneath professional courtesy. But to those close to him, it was clear. He was tired of being the secret ingredient in someone else's recipe. And Bob, who had finally tasted recognition, wasn't about to share the spotlight. Heads changed everything, artistically, commercially, and personally. It cemented their legacy, but it also sowed the seeds of a fracture that would grow more visible with each passing year. By the late 1970s, whispers began to circulate through the jazz community. Whispers of heated arguments during sessions, whispers of Larry storming out after yet another retake, whispers of Bob refusing to bend his vision even when the music cried out for freedom. Outwardly, the two men maintained professionalism, smiles for the cameras, compliments in interviews, but those who worked with them knew better. The tension was real, and it was thick enough to choke on. Bob James, now more visible than ever, became increasingly protective of his reputation. He had built a brand, smooth yet sophisticated, accessible yet intricate, and he wasn't about to let anyone derail it, not even the guitarist who had helped him build it. Larry Carlton, meanwhile, was watching his reputation grow among musicians, if not the wider public. Other artists revered him. He was the guitarist's guitarist, the player everyone wanted in their band. But still, he lacked the recognition that came with his contributions to Bob's projects. The studio environment became a minefield. What once had been sparks of creative tension now felt like personal attacks. Larry's improvisations, once celebrated, were now criticized by Bob as too much. Bob's demands for perfection, once admired, were now seen by Larry as suffocating. Each session carried the unspoken question, how long can this last? And yet, they couldn't stay away from each other. Their musical chemistry was undeniable. Record labels, audiences, and even fellow musicians wanted to see them together, to hear that combustible blend of order and chaos. They needed each other's gifts, even if they no longer liked each other's presence. Behind closed doors, no one dared mention the obvious, that this partnership was cracking. Too much was at stake. Too much money, too much prestige. But every unspoken word, every stifled frustration, added another crack to the foundation. It was only a matter of time before the weight of silence became too heavy to bear. By the dawn of the 1980s, the partnership between Bob James and Larry Carlton had entered a dangerous new phase. The music they had created together was no longer a curiosity reserved for jazz circles. It was a commercial juggernaut. Radio stations were devoting entire blocks to smooth jazz. Record stores had sections devoted to the new sound. And at the center of it all stood Bob James, the man hailed as its architect. Bob's reputation grew with each release, and so did the financial rewards. He had become not just a pianist or arranger, but a brand. The very phrase, "a Bob James record," promised lush orchestrations, sleek grooves, and a polish that made it accessible to the masses. His records sold, his tours packed houses, his royalties climbed into the stratosphere. But behind that polished exterior lay an imbalance that would haunt the partnership forever. Larry Carlton, the guitarist who had given Bob's work its raw edge and explosive energy, was often treated by the industry as nothing more than a session musician. The contracts were cold and unforgiving. Bob's name carried the marquee, the royalties, and the recognition, while Larry's contribution was reduced to featured guitarist or buried in liner notes. In many cases, Larry was paid a one-time session fee, sometimes a handsome one, but never comparable to the royalties Bob enjoyed for decades afterward. It wasn't that Bob didn't recognize Larry's value. He did. But Bob also knew the business. Record labels invested in names, not sidemen. They wanted a face to market, a central figure to build an empire around. And Bob was willing to play the game. He convinced himself that this imbalance was the natural order of things. After all, it was his compositions, his arrangements, his vision that shaped the albums. Wasn't it only fair that he reaped the benefits? But Larry saw it differently. He knew his guitar wasn't just an addition. It was the element that made Bob's music leap off the page. It was the scream in the middle of the silence, the grit that gave polish its bite. Fans often pointed to his solos as the highlights of the records, the moments that gave them chills. Yet his bank statements told another story. A sideman's wage, even as his playing defined the sound of a generation. Friends recall Larry's quiet bitterness during this period. He wasn't a man prone to public outbursts, but those close to him knew how much it gnawed at him. The industry had trapped him in the role of eternal sideman, even as his guitar thundered through some of the most iconic recordings of the era. The sense of betrayal was sharp, not always directed solely at Bob, but at the system that allowed such inequities to fester. Bob, meanwhile, wasn't blind. He knew Larry deserved more recognition, but he also knew that recognition came at a price. To admit Larry as an equal partner would be to undercut his own carefully constructed empire. And so the betrayals came not in words or actions, but in silences and omissions, in the checks that arrived smaller than they should have been, in the interviews where Larry's name went unspoken, in the label contracts that never gave him a seat at the table. This was how the music industry worked. Quiet betrayals dressed up as business. Smiles on stage, tension off it. Bob and Larry continued to collaborate, but the ground beneath them was no longer solid. It was shifting sand, and every note they played together carried the weight of unspoken resentment. It was 1984 in Los Angeles, when the fragile partnership between Bob James and Larry Carlton nearly shattered in front of thousands. The performance was meant to be a crowning moment, an elegant showcase of Bob's sophisticated arrangements, with Larry adding his trademark fire. The set list was carefully plotted, the dynamics rehearsed down to the measure. Bob, ever the perfectionist, wanted the show to be flawless, a testament to the brand he had spent a decade building. But Larry Carlton had grown restless. Years of being contained, of being forced to color inside the lines, had left him itching for rebellion. That night, rebellion came. Midway through the set, during what was supposed to be a restrained melodic solo, Larry let loose. His fingers flew across the fretboard, pouring out years of frustration in a fiery cascade of notes. The solo stretched longer than planned, each phrase louder, wilder, more defiant than the last. The audience erupted in cheers, sensing something unscripted, something raw. But Bob wasn't cheering. Behind the piano, Bob's jaw tightened. He had built this concert around precision, and now the centerpiece was unraveling before his eyes. He tried to rein Larry in with subtle cues, even cutting back his own accompaniment to signal the solo should end. But Larry didn't stop. For nearly 5 minutes, he poured every ounce of rebellion into the guitar, ending with a high, sustained note that seemed less like music and more like a declaration of war. The crowd loved it. The musicians on stage exchanged uneasy glances, caught between awe and fear. And when the set ended, the applause was thunderous. To the audience, it was one of the most electrifying performances they had ever witnessed. To Bob and Larry, it was something else entirely, a confrontation in the language of music. Backstage, the tension exploded. Witnesses recall harsh words exchanged in hushed but furious tones. Bob accused Larry of sabotaging the show, of putting ego above professionalism. Larry shot back that Bob had been suffocating the music for years, reducing it to a sterile product. For the first time, their grievances came boiling to the surface. No punches were thrown, no instruments smashed. But in many ways, that night was the breaking point. The partnership survived. Barely. They continued to work together on occasion, but the trust had been damaged beyond repair. What the audience saw as brilliance was, in truth, the sound of a partnership teetering on the edge of collapse. By the time the 1980s faded into the 1990s, the once explosive partnership between Bob James and Larry Carlton was no longer the talk of recording studios. The magic that had burned so brightly during the CTI years and later on albums like Heads had dimmed to a faint glow. What had begun as an alliance of necessity, sharpened into brilliance by tension and pride, now dissolved into silence. On the surface, there was no dramatic headline to point to, no public feud splashed across magazines, no lawsuits or shouting matches caught on camera. Instead, the distance between Bob and Larry unfolded quietly, like a slow fade-out at the end of a record. They still spoke, still crossed paths, and even collaborated occasionally, but the urgency that once pulled them together was gone. Their calls became infrequent, their projects separate, and the partnership that had defined a decade drifted into memory. Bob James had new ventures to pursue. His creation of Foreplay in 1991 was not just another band, it was a juggernaut. With bassist Nathan East, drummer Harvey Mason, and guitarist Lee Ritenour, later replaced by Larry himself, Foreplay dominated the charts and became the gold standard of smooth jazz. Bob was in his element again, leading, arranging, shaping music into an empire that bore his unmistakable polish. The name Foreplay became synonymous with sophistication, radio success, and commercial triumph. For Bob, It was the validation of everything he had been building since the CTI days. Larry, meanwhile, finally leaned into his independence. His solo career blossomed during the late 80s and 90s. Albums like Alone But Never Alone and On Solid Ground showcased his versatility, not just as a guitarist, but as a composer and bandleader in his own right. No longer relegated to the sidelines, Larry carved a path where his voice could ring unfiltered, without the constraints of Bob's perfectionist frameworks. He became known as Mr. 335, his guitar itself a signature in the jazz fusion world. Critics who once called him a sideman now lauded him as one of the most distinctive voices on the instrument. Yet fans noticed what was missing. Separately, Bob and Larry were brilliant, but together they had been transcendent. Their sound was an alchemy that couldn't be recreated with other collaborators. Audiences whispered about the absence. Why weren't they recording together anymore? Why had their once fierce partnership dissolved into occasional polite reunions? Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said Bob had cut Larry off after the infamous live performance where Larry's solo defied the script. Others claimed Larry had grown bitter over years of financial inequity, refusing to lend his genius to projects that didn't give him proper credit. Some even suggested their egos were simply too large to share a room anymore. In reality, the truth was far more complex. The rift wasn't one event, but 1,000 small cuts, contracts that paid Larry less than he deserved, interviews where Bob's name loomed while Larry's went unspoken, sessions where tension stifled creativity. It wasn't hatred that separated them, but exhaustion. Both men were tired of the unspoken resentments, tired of fighting the same battles, tired of trying to force harmony out of chaos. And so, silence filled the space where music once lived. Bob rarely mentioned Larry in interviews, focusing on his bandmates in Foreplay and his growing discography. Larry, though gracious, sidestepped questions about Bob, speaking instead about his own projects and influences. For years, the two men let the rumors swirl, their silence a tacit acknowledgement that the partnership was fractured. But for the fans, the absence hurt most. The sound of Bob James and Larry Carlton together was unforgettable, a fusion of order and rebellion, structure and fire. It was a sound that lived on in vinyl grooves and radio broadcasts, but not in new recordings. Each year that passed without a reunion only deepened the myth of their rift. And the longer they stayed silent, the more the legend grew, until it seemed less like history and more like a ghost haunting the jazz world. Decades later, with most of their contemporaries either gone or retired, Bob James reached an age where pride no longer mattered. At 85, he had nothing left to prove. His career was secure, his legacy cemented. The accolades had piled high: Grammy Awards, chart-topping albums, and recognition as the founding father of smooth jazz. But with time came reflection, and reflection brought a reckoning. In a candid interview, Bob was asked about the relationships that shaped his music. For years, he had been careful with his words, guarded in how he spoke about collaborators. But now, with a soft voice and weary eyes, he finally addressed the elephant in the room: Larry Carlton. For the first time, Bob admitted what insiders had whispered for decades: that Larry wasn't just a sideman, wasn't just a session player, but a partner in shaping the sound that made Bob James a household name. He spoke openly of the tension in the studio, of arguments that derailed sessions, of moments when Larry's fire threatened to consume the careful structures he built. He confessed that, at times, he resented Larry's defiance, his refusal to bend. But he also admitted that without Larry, his music might never have reached the heights it did. "I pushed him too hard," Bob confessed. "I wanted everything to be perfect." But perfection can't breathe without chaos, and Larry gave me that chaos. He made the music live. The jazz world was stunned. For decades, fans had speculated, filling the silence with their own theories. Now, at 85, Bob gave them the truth. He acknowledged the inequities, the financial imbalances, the spotlight that never shone equally. He admitted that he had benefited from a system that often exploited players like Larry. And he admitted regret, that he had not given Carlton the recognition he deserved while their partnership was still alive and burning. Larry, when asked about Bob's comments, responded with characteristic humility. He didn't gloat, didn't lash out. Instead, he nodded, acknowledging the truth in Bob's words. For him, the vindication wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. After decades of silence, the acknowledgement felt like a weight finally lifted. Bob's confession sent ripples through the jazz world. Younger musicians who idolized both men saw it as a lesson. That greatness often comes at the cost of pride. That collaboration requires more than talent. It requires humility. For fans, it was closure, a final chapter in a story that had remained unfinished for too long. At 85, Bob James had nothing to lose by speaking the truth. But in doing so, he gave the world something invaluable: perspective. He reminded us that behind every legendary record lies a human story, one of ambition, friction, and unspoken debts. And he reminded us that reconciliation, even if late, is better than silence. The confession was bittersweet. It did not erase the years of distance, nor did it undo the inequities of the past. But it gave the partnership of Bob James and Larry Carlton a proper ending. One rooted not in silence, but in truth. And in that truth lay something almost as powerful as their music: honesty. Bob James and Larry Carlton's story proves that genius isn't always born from harmony, but from conflict, pride, and the scars left unspoken. After decades of silence, Bob finally revealed the truth at 85. Was it redemption or an apology too late? Let us know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories behind the legends.